right. If you would take your Bibles this evening and turn with me to the sacred scriptures. Actually, it's the sacred writings. Y'all know exactly where we're going, right? Proverbs. One of the wisdom books Paul called Timothy to look into the sacred writings, the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. This is one of the books of what is called wisdom literature in your Bibles, the book of Proverbs. I would ask that you pray for me while we start this new study. This will be an interesting one. I hope that you will find it interesting. I've already found it interesting just working on the introduction. This will be an introduction to Proverbs. So this first time together, this first sermon will be less sermon and more introduction. It'll be more lesson than it is sermon. We'll start sermon probably next week. But I would encourage you this way. I would encourage you to take notes. Proverbs is challenging, and when you start studying Proverbs in depth, you find that we've oftentimes misinterpreted and misapplied Proverbs in the past. Proverbs points us to wisdom, points us to the royal way of wisdom, and so many times we take Proverbs like quips, like wise sayings that we can apply to our life to get what we want for ourselves or to better our position, and that's not the point of the book of Proverbs. The point of the book of Proverbs is to point us to the one that is wisdom himself. And so in Proverbs chapter number 1, if you're there, we'll read verse 7. It says, of course, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. That would be a good key verse, probably the key verse for all of this book. You find in chapter number 9 and verse number 10, and that is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. So what is a proverb? If I haven't said it already, I would encourage you to take notes for this study, because this one will be a profitable study. A proverb is actually a brief epigram, or it's a maxim. It's often called an adage or a saying that is a metaphorical form. It embodies a common observation. It's something that we look for, a short saying that incorporates some small truth, some wise saying. And so the book of Proverbs really is a collection of wisdom teachings, but this collection of wisdom teachings that we know as the book of Proverbs offers us advice about prudent living, about righteous living. It contains many extended poems, and we're going to look at those in time, but it talks to us about wise behavior. It also has a number of short, pithy sayings, and we would call those just practical advice. And so in these 31 chapters that we know as the book of Proverbs, there are about 10,000 words. 10,000 words in 31 chapters. 25% of them have to do with how we act, our behavior. 65% of them are just descriptions of what things are like. And about 10% of them describe for us what things will be like at some point in the future. And so that's what Proverbs is as a very brief introduction. Most of the Proverbs we know by reading the very opening, the very first verse. It tells us the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And so most of the Proverbs were composed by Solomon. When did Solomon reign? Do you all know your Bible timeline? You recognize when Solomon reigned, so we can set this book in its proper order, in its proper time, place. Solomon reigned about 950 BC. And Solomon ruled from 971 BC to 931 BC. And so these sayings, this book of Proverbs, this book of poems and practical advice was probably compiled undoubtedly it was written during his earthly reign. Now we do know that in his later years, his heart was turned from the Lord. That was recorded for us in 1 Kings chapter number 11. And when his heart was turned away from the Lord, he sacrificed much of his wisdom. Proverbs 25, verse 1 records for us, and we'll look at that in a minute, it records for us some additional proverbs, but it tells us that Hezekiah's men copied those proverbs. They compiled those proverbs for us from the annals of the king, from the annals of King Solomon. And so Hezekiah was one of the greatest kings of Judah. We know from history that he reigned from about 715 BC to about 690 BC. And so the final compilation of the Proverbs probably occurred about that time. About 700 BC was when this book came into its completion. We do know that the contents could have all been in existence even though they weren't gathered into one book during the lifetime of Solomon. But yet during Solomon's lifetime, all of this literature that we have in the book of Solomon already existed during the lifetime of Solomon. And so I want to give you a very quick analysis by author. The opening few verses here, we call it the title or the introduction, called the motto. You find that in the first 7 verses. The title says, we've already looked at it, the Proverbs of Solomon. And so it may be intended as a section heading, and really the Proverbs of Solomon are the first 9 chapters, chapters 1 through 9. It's Solomon is named here at the outset. Solomon is the primary author of all of the Proverbs. But Solomon's collection of Proverbs, those things that he wrote, they're not going to be included until we get to chapter 10. And that heading then is going to be repeated in chapter 10. Proverbs, Solomon's own proverbs are included a little bit later. And they're included later so that the reader can be prepared through all of this introduction. He will have an understanding of all the characters. He'll have an understanding of all of these early admonitions. But the introduction and then the extended title in verses 2 through 6, it impresses upon us one thing, and that is this book is not to be read as an anthology. It is a course of education in the life of wisdom. Solomon wants us to be wise sons, wise daughters. He expects us to be wise children. The motto in verse number 7 that we read, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. That motto is stated right up front, so Solomon can clearly articulate what his theme is for the entire book, and that is the fear of the Lord. That's the first section. We then go into verse number 8. My son, hear the instruction of thy father. Forsake not the law of thy mother. And what he's going to do now from chapter 1, verse number 8 through chapter number 9 is he's going to sing and tell the praises of wisdom. Solomon takes these next 9 chapters and presents what we know is a series of fatherly talks, a series of 17 speeches. And all of those talks are regarding the primary character, Lady Wisdom. And they press upon the reader that the reader must make a choice. You must make a choice between wisdom and folly, because that's the only choice you have. One of these guides will be the guide for your life. And who is it that you're going to follow? And then you come to chapter 10. In chapter 10, verse number 1, we see the phrase repeated, the Proverbs of Solomon. This is the second section, if you will, in chapter number 10. And it consists of a number of individual sayings which then illustrate the outworking of these 2 guides that Solomon puts before his sons. You have the guide of wisdom and the guide of folly. And he takes 9 chapters in section 1 to explain to you the differences. And then starting in chapter 10, we have these little individual sayings on how they work themselves out. And each one of those is a microcosm of the larger skirmish, of the larger stress between these two competitors for your life. Wisdom and folly are competing for your life. Then we come to section 3, not chapter 3. We come to section 3 in chapter 22. Chapter 22 is the words of wise men. You see that starting in verse 17. Bow down thine ear and hear the words of the wise. That is the words of wise men. You see that also in chapter 24 at verse 23. These things also belong to the wise. These are the words of the wise men. And so here the teaching style then returns back to the first 9 chapters. What he had in section 1. And it again is a praise of wisdom. He goes back to giving the fatherly advice. However, these are not the Proverbs of Solomon. These are the words that are delivered through the voices of many experienced men. What he calls here the wise men. These wise men, we'll find out as we get to this section in time, that they are no doubt familiar with the wisdom of Solomon, because it is the wisdom of Solomon that they then express to us in this series of speeches. They may indeed be the same ones who copied his writings. They may be the ones who compiled and collected his writings for us in the later chapters that we're going to read about. Come with me now to Proverbs chapter 25, and you'll see in chapter 25 and verse number 1. These are also Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied out. So this is a third section of Solomon's Proverbs, but these are Proverbs specifically that were compiled about the time of Hezekiah, which is around that 700 BC mark that we mentioned. And so this is the 5th section. Section 5 has Solomon's terseness, if you will. It's similar to section 2, but the sayings there are longer. They have fewer of these antitheses, if you will. And it's often been said that Hezekiah's men do not possess Solomon's wit. We know brevity is the soul of wit, and Hezekiah's men don't seem to possess that same character as Solomon does. But we see that in these verses, the scribes of Hezekiah have nonetheless grouped many, many more sayings together than we see in the earlier sections. So they're longer here, but this section contains some very important addresses, some very important admonitions, and they also have some additional audiences that Solomon doesn't seem to address directly. It's almost as if Solomon in the earlier section has a small group he's speaking to, and now Solomon's words to a broader audience are copied out and collected by Hezekiah's men. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Let me show you a couple of these instances. In chapter 25, verse 2, it's the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. He's addressing kings and the men of the king's court. Chapter 26, verse number 1. As snow in summer and as rain in harvest, so honor is not seemly for a fool. He addresses foolish. Come down in chapter 26 to verse number 13. The slothful man saith, there's a lion in the way, a lion is in the streets. This is an address to sluggards. And as you know, Solomon addresses them with a different name. He addresses them with the name slothful. So slothful and sluggards are both addressed here. Chapter 26, look to verse number 17. He that passes by and meddleth with strife belonging not to him is like one that taketh a dog by the ears. The rest of this chapter is to a group that we will call the mischief makers. Those that go by and meddle in affairs that are not their own. In today's terms, we would say, mind your own business, right? So Hezekiah's men are not bashful about saying, go mind your own business. Then we come to the 6th section, chapter number 30. Chapter number 30, you'll see the words of Agur, the son of Jacob. The words of Agur compose chapter 30. Section 7 is chapter 31. It starts, chapter 31, verse 1, with the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. These two sections, section 6 and 7, which is chapter 30 and 31, are written by men that are not associated with Solomon. They're included in Solomon's book, but they are men that are not associated with Solomon. They are, in fact, from non-Israelite authors. And we know very little about these two persons. Chapter 30, the words of Agur, and chapter 31, the words of King Lemuel. Some consider King Lemuel might be an alternate name for Solomon. We don't know that for sure. I think probably not. I think it's a different person. But we do know this. Here's an interesting tidbit for you. These two sections, chapter 30 and chapter 31 of our Bible, were often separated in Hebrew Old Testament, and then they were moved to a different location. They weren't here at chapter 30 and 31. Also in the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, these two chapters were contained within chapter 24. Chapter 24 is the further words of the wise men, and so they considered Agur and King Lemuel to be amongst the further words of the wise men. And so what they would do is chapter 30 were placed right before the further words of the wise men at chapter 24, verse 23, and all of chapter 31 was placed at the end of chapter 24. That made chapter 24 very, very long. Chapter 24 would have 77 verses, because all of chapter 30 and all of chapter 31 was contained within chapter 24. That'd be a long chapter to read if you were reading a proverb a day, which is often what is recommended. Read a proverb every day, because there's 31 proverbs and 31 days in a typical month. That leads us to the last half of chapter 31, which is section number 8. Section number 8 is the last portion of chapter 31. This is one that you're probably familiar with. Starting at verse number 10, this section is called an exquisite picture of a truly lovely wife. She has all of the virtues and customs of the Eastern nations, but her moral teachings are suitable for all times. Here's what's interesting that you may not know about the rest of this chapter. From verse number 10 through the end of the chapter in verse number 31, every verse in the section begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and they're all in order. So not only is this a praise of a godly wife, it is an alphabetic acrostic of the Hebrew alphabet. And so it is an alphabetic acrostic of wifely wisdom. And that's the title we'll give it when we get there. The alphabetic acrostic of wifely wisdom. Do you know where you can find another alphabetic acrostic of the Hebrew alphabet? You may know this, you may not. Psalm 119. If you've ever looked at the sections of Psalm 119, and you've noticed that that very long psalm is broken up into paragraphs, and it has a strange word at the beginning of each one of those sections, that strange word at the beginning of each of those sections is the Hebrew alphabet in order. And Psalm 119 is an alphabetic acrostic of that psalm. So these attributes in Psalm 31 bring the book to a close. And it is a picture of a united family. You'll see in chapter 31, verse number 28. Her children arise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, he praises her. A picture of a united family that honors a godly mother, because the godly mother is the one who is most capable to build into her family the character of godly wisdom that is promoted throughout the entire book. What a fitting close to this royal way of wisdom. So who is this book addressed to? Let's go back and see again. Chapter number 6, verse 6. In chapter 6, verse number 6, you see the words, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways." Verse 9, "How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard?" So twice Solomon addresses this person called sluggard. One time, and only one time that I can find, does he directly address the foolish man in chapter 14. Look at verse number 7. "Go from the presence of foolish man when thou perceivest not in him the lips of knowledge." One proverb, a little further back, chapter 27. And verse 2. This proverb is addressed to a stranger, the foreigner, the sojourner in the land. "Let another man praise thee, not thine own mouth. A stranger, not thine own lips." Those are the addressees. Those are the ones that Proverbs is written to in a minor sense. However, there are 19 times, 19 references where Proverbs is addressed directly to my son or my children. And interesting to me was the fact that all of these times where Proverbs is addressed to my son or to my children occur in the first 9 chapters, where Solomon is giving these speeches between wisdom and folly, the wise and the foolish. Back in chapter 1, you see him give his introduction, his title in the first 7 verses, and then immediately when he gets to verse number 8 of chapter 1, he says, "My son, hear the instruction of thy father. My son, hear the instruction of thy father." He doesn't let up. At verse number 10, "My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not." At verse number 15, "My son, walk not thou in the way with them." I mean, it goes on like this. It just keeps going on. 19 references in the first 9 chapters. He says, "My son, my son." But it's not just to the young men, son. In chapter 4, verse number 1, "Hear ye children the instruction of a father, and attend to know understanding. For I give you good doctrine, forsake not my law." So he's addressing primarily his sons. He wants them to grow up and be good kings, right? Good princes. But he doesn't forget the fact that children are included. The girls will benefit as well. But I want you to see something here. And this is not original with me, but the book of Proverbs is primarily a father that is giving advice to a son. And at least in the opening chapters, at minimum in the opening section, but I can argue in all of the sections, but at minimum in the opening section, this father is giving advice to his son, and it is specifically relationship advice. He wants him to know how to find, how to keep, and how to value the virtuous wife, and how to protect the filial benefits that follow along with her. And so while he's on this royal path of life, there is other advice that's provided along the way. But that's incidental. That's secondary. Some of this secondary advice will include business advice and legal advice for the courts and other interpersonal matters, but the overriding theme is the wise father attempts to directly influence the selection of a mate for his son. He wants to have him earnestly compare the character and the quality of two women who are striving for his affection. And each one of these suitors is in a competition. They are competing with each other, and they are calling, they are coaxing, and they are compelling the son into intimacy with them. The first one we'll meet in chapter 1, verse 20. Wisdom crieth without, she uttereth her voice in the streets. Lady Wisdom has been introduced, and she is frequently described throughout the first 9 chapters. Lady Wisdom is allowed to speak for herself in chapter 8. Her benefits are innumerable. So mark Lady Wisdom. We'll describe her in detail in upcoming lessons. And there's another lady, but that's not her character. I would call her Fetching Folly. She is a trickster. She's a temptress. She's sinister. She's a spoiler. She only speaks once. She's only allowed to speak once. You'll see her in chapter 9. And Fetching Folly is the bitter enemy of Lady Wisdom. And although he is unaware, she is the nemesis of the son. Her plots are vigorous. She attempts to seduce the son out of the royal path of life and into her lair. She only has 2 assets: fair speech and shallow beauty. That's all she has. Then we have 2 other women that appear beyond Lady Wisdom and Fetching Folly. In chapter number 5, we come across a woman named Spouse Sympathy. Spouse Sympathy, we'll describe her later, is a rather promiscuous partner who has chosen the path of folly, not the path of wisdom. And then in chapter 7, we meet another woman who is a harlot. You can call her harlot hellbound or hell's hound as you wish, because she does both, and she is both. And she is a persistent prostitute. By the way, if you are in chapter 7, you can look at verse number 19. One of her speeches is, "The goodman of the house is not at home. He is gone on a long journey." And so you can see that not only is she a harlot, she's also a married woman. And so we're going to take these 2 and we're going to dissect their activities when we come to these chapters. Did I tell you I needed prayer? Yeah. Y'all pray for me. Needless to say, we are told to avoid both the prostitute and the promiscuous wife, and both are indeed strange. The text calls them strange. The text uses the term foreign because of their continual activity outside of the bounds of law, outside of the bounds of social norm, but more importantly, it's because it's outside the bounds of a covenant relationship. That's taught in the book of Proverbs, because Proverbs is very clear. Any relationship with another person's wife or with a prostitute is always wrong. And so I want you to see that although Proverbs is written primarily to a young man, the admonitions are directly assignable and directly applicable to many others. We've already said in chapter 4, verse number 1, "Hear, ye children, the instruction of a father." And so, young lady, even though we are speaking primarily to the young men and cautioning him about the ladies in his life, young lady, you should also avoid the philandering man, and the older person should avoid the prospecting stranger that is not his own spouse. Now, along the way, let me introduce you to three more persons. Three more persons that we'll meet along the way, and these are my names. These are names that I give them to keep track of them in my own mind, and I want you to meet three more persons. One of them is simple. You know this person by his sippy cup. One of them is stiff-neck. You know this person by his snuff can. And one of them is scorner. This person you'll see a long ways off because he will always be wearing his sovereign crown. Simple carries a sippy cup because he's not grown up. He carries his sippy cup everywhere. That's how you know him. He's simple. He's immature, is the Bible word. And so you know him because he always has his sippy cup. It's okay if you're simple and you're immature when you're 2. When you're 30, it doesn't look so good. When you're 50 and you still have your sippy cup, there's a problem. Stiff-neck is also easily recognized, and he carries a snuff can. You see, he's different than simple. Simple doesn't know better. Stiff-neck knows better, and that's why I've used a snuff can for him. You see, stiff-neck knows better, he just doesn't want to do better. Stiff-neck is the guy that you can say, well, do you know that that causes cancer? Yeah, I don't care. But do you know Surgeon General says, yeah, but I don't care. But do you know that'll make your teeth rot out? I don't care. I've still got my teeth. But don't you know? I don't care. You see, simple doesn't know better. Stiff-neck just doesn't do better. And then we come to this guy named Scorner. He wears the sovereign crown. I could have called it the stolen crown. You see, the other two can be quiet. Sometimes not, you know. Simple's going to cry when the sippy cup runs dry. Stiff-neck will, you know, he'll scream if you try to take his snuff can away. But Scorner's the guy that you recognize because he's always loud. He's always boisterous. He's always giving speeches. And it's generally about, I'm the king of my own life. I'm going to do whatever I want. You're never going to convince me. I'm never coming off the throne. And why are you preaching at me? I'm in charge, not you. I'm going to do what I want. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in your Bible. I don't believe in you. And you just need to be quiet and go away. And as we go along, well, let's just do this. You're in chapter 1. We can meet all three of these people on the same street corner. Chapter 1, verse number 22. How long, ye simple ones, will you love simplicity? And the scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. So we meet all three of these persons standing in one street corner. Look where they're at. Verse 20. Wisdom crieth aloud. She uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief place of concourse, in the opening of the city gates. In the city she uttereth her words, saying, how long, simple, and scorners, and fools. And so what these three are doing, we see all three of them on the same street corner, collectively ignoring Lady Wisdom. Lady Wisdom is calling, and these three are ignoring. And so, as we go through, we'll learn that you have to handle these three differently. Simple can be taught. Stiff-necked needs spanked. Scorner, there's nothing you can do with him. The text will tell you in a few weeks when we get there, the text says scorner, just drive him away from you. You can't fix him. So here's the key verses. In Proverbs, the source of wisdom is always God. Apart from God, there is no true insight. There's no true knowledge in the world. It is the Lord that disposes our direction. It is the Lord that gives us true knowledge. It is God that grants us any ability we have for wisdom. It is God that gives us all true learning. Everything comes from Him. Again, chapter 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Come with me to chapter 3. We'll mark some key verses as we go through the Psalms, or as we go through Proverbs. Chapter 3, verse number 5. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart. Lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. We come to chapter number 9 of Proverbs, chapter number 9, and read with me verse number 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. Recognize that all of this is still a gift from heaven's throne. At Proverbs chapter 20, at chapter number 20 and verse 12, we're reminded, the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord hath made even both of them. Everything, the ability to hear, the ability to see, and understand. This is a picture, a type of our understanding and our wisdom. The hearing ear, the seeing eye, the Lord hath made both of them. So here's some interpretive challenges. We'll go through these quickly. As you read through Proverbs with me, as you study this at home, and you take notes here, Proverbs should be understood as principles, not promises. Don't read Proverbs like they're promises. Read them like they are principles. Most Proverbs do not state or insist upon an absolute law, but they are succinct, short statements of a general principle which always depend upon the right time and the right circumstances. Let me see if I can illustrate that for you. Let me give you an example. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. If I tell you an apple a day keeps the doctor away, are you going to eat an apple every day? Is that true in every circumstance? Is that true in every place? Is that true for every person? It's not, is it? Go one apple every day, and you're never going to need a doctor. What happens if you eat two? What happens if you miss a day? What happens if you're allergic to apples? What's the principle that's taught there? The principle is if you eat well, if you eat consistently well, you'll have a health benefit from it, right? That's the way you need to read Proverbs. Let me see if I can illustrate with a few of them. Most of these are in the appropriate section. Chapter 22, look at verse 13. 23, I said 22. Look at chapter 23, verse 13. There's the one I wanted. Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. Thou shalt beat him with the rod, and shalt deliver his soul from hell. Want your children to be saved? Beat them. Beat them into a profession of faith, right? That's not how our children are saved, is it? And, by the way, discipline is always performed with a rod, never a belt, never a hand, never a switch, never a fly swatter. So you know the principle here, right? It's the principle that's important. He's not really saying beat him with a rod, and by beating him with a rod, you deliver him from hell, right? It's the principle that's important. You teach them principles. You teach them discipline. You teach them wisdom, according to this book. Let's go to another one. 22. Move back up to 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he will not depart from it. Again, this is a principle, not a promise, isn't it? Proverbs states what is generally true, not what is absolutely true. How do we know? Well, we all know children who were raised correctly. We know children that were raised in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, according to Ephesians 6. But when they reach adulthood, they leave the faith. And know some of you, some of us that are raised outside of the faith, and yet when we come to be adults, we embrace the faith. And so if this was a promise, if you raise up a child correctly, he'll never wander, he'll never stray. It's a principle, isn't it? Good raising correctly, generally, in most cases, does lead to good adulthood. It's not a promise that you can take to every single individual case. Let me give you another one, probably even more clear. Chapter 26, verse 4. Chapter 26, verse 4. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Does this proverb appear to be contradictory? It kind of does at first blush, doesn't it? This proverb appears to be so contradictory that in the first century, there were many Hebrew rabbis that wanted to have the entire book of Proverbs tossed out of the canon of scriptures altogether. They said God never contradicts himself. God made errors, and these statements were evidence that the book obviously was not inspired. And so I would say this means we don't memorize Proverbs and then apply them to every situation. Proverbs have to be applied at the correct time and in the correct circumstances. How do we apply that to this verse? A wise person has to know what kind of a fool he's dealing with. A wise woman has to know what kind of a fool she's answering in order to apply this proverb correctly, right? If it's the particular kind of fool who will not learn and will simply take away all of your time and your energy, then don't bother answering them. However, if it's the fool that can learn, and by not answering them, you'll have worse problems, then by all means, take the time and answer them. That's what this proverb means. And so time and circumstances apply to when we apply the Proverbs, right? Now, there are expository portions of this book, and we'll look at those in that manner, expository. But then there's also, when we get past the introduction of wisdom, then there's a lot of topical, thematic type studies that can be had. And so, God and man, the fool, the sluggard, the friend, the family. There's some good stuff in here about money, borrowing and lending. I suspect we'll take a number of these, but we're going to start with the speeches in chapters 1 through 9 that compel the son to embrace wisdom, and we're going to do that because we're going to find out that the father that is speaking is God. Solomon is writing, and he's writing to his son, but he's writing to point all of us to true wisdom, and true wisdom is found in the further son of Solomon, the later descendant of Solomon, the all-wise son of Solomon that came as the son of God. That's the one that Proverbs is pointing us to. It's that son that we need to see throughout this book. So that's a real quick, brief introduction. Thank you for your attention. Let's stand.